When entering this film, I was partially wondering if this movie will actually be good, or do people just like that he's black. I know everyone says it's great, but after watching the Fine Bros reaction video, I began thinking that people only care that he's black or that it's now a white man. So I was wondering whether it would be a good movie, or if it's just going to be a progressive movie with a black cast. After watching it, I will say that this is a good movie. I'm so happy they didn't do the stereotypical black man story. There are so many stories where the black man is the main character and the bad guys are the white people. This movie doesn't do that. Sure, Claw's a white guy, but the story doesn't revolve some kind of rich white guy with too much power. In fact, this movie does the opposite. It's the main character who's a rich black guy with too much power. If you don't already know, this movie is about a comic book superhero named Black Panther. We first saw him in the Captain America Civil War movie, where we saw his dad die. This movie takes place, I think they said, a week after the events of Civil War. Black Panther is now the king of Wakanda, a technologically advanced civilization disguised as a third world country. Without spoiling too much, a common story for Black Panther is about being overthrown. Wakanda's monarchy system is that if you win in combat, you will become the king. Not a great system, but that's Black Panther's storyline. What I really like about the movie is that they actually talk about things. As I said earlier, the main character is a black guy with too much power, and they have to disguise the civilization as a third world country, and they're talking about it. The stories with the mean white rich man, they're just the mean white rich man. Here they talk and have discussions about power. A part of me does wish they talk about it a little bit more. I do think they missed a potential storyline that they could have discussed, but it's a small thing. But I still can't say what it is without spoiling. The pacing in this movie is really good. I was always glued to the screen and there wasn't a moment where I was losing interest. I do have a slight problem with the beginning and the end of the movie. The beginning wasn't anything amazing. The movie kind of starts and we just go with it. In the beginning, they spend so much time just showing the Wakandan culture, which is good and it has a good payoff, but wasn't the most interesting thing. The ending wasn't that great either. It's good. I said I was always glued to the screen and that there wasn't a dull moment. And that does apply to the finale also, but that's the problem. It's just like any other scene. The end fight is usually the climax of the story, and nothing about it really felt climactic. It was good, but I did have a moment during it where I said to myself, oh wait, we're at the climax now. Everyone's motivation in this movie were also really good, especially the bad guys. It's still pretty obvious who's the good guys and who are the bad guys, but everyone's motivations are so legitimate that you don't question their choices. People say that a great villain doesn't see himself as a villain. Although that's true, this movie takes it a step beyond to justify the villain's actions. I said earlier that they switched it and made the main hero the guy with too much power. If you want to switch the story back and keep the guy with too much power the main villain, you can still do it with minor changes because they do so well explaining the villain's side of the story. The fighting in this movie is amazing. Choreography is great, but the one thing I want to emphasize is that this is a brutal film. This has to be one of the most brutal Marvel movie. I heard kids crying in the theater. I am happy how brutal they made it because I feel like filmmakers would try to make something more brutal by adding blood, gore, maybe show bones. But what makes this movie more brutal than anything are the characters' intentions. The characters are brutal because they are trying to be. I think that's more effective than just adding blood. In fact, there really isn't any more blood than any other Marvel film. These fights are most brutal because of the characters' intentions. Usually, Marvel movies have so much comedy in it, but for this one, they toned it down. Honestly, best thing that could have happened. It's expected for a Marvel film to have comedy, and I have mentioned in some of my past reviews that the comedy doesn't bother me that much. It's refreshing to finally watch a moment be dramatic and not to have jokes to keep it lighthearted. I mentioned both how the fights were brutal and there wasn't much comedy, and I'm making it sound like it's a dark movie. It's really not. It's still lighthearted. Despite kids crying in the theater, there's nothing that would ruin a kid. I want this movie to be the example other Marvel movies follow. You can have brutal and evil villains and you can still have it without adding comedy. This is still as lighthearted as all other Marvel movies, but they allow themselves to be dramatic when they need to be. Let me quickly talk about each character. Chadwick Boseman as Black Panther is amazing. We already saw a little bit of him in Civil War. I will say that difference that Black Panther is sort of the badass of the group in Civil War. Although he's still cool, he's more human in this movie, and I don't mean that in a bad way. Michael B. Jordan plays the villain Eric Killmonger, and he's great. Michael redeems himself for being part of Fantastic, which I think it's based on a Marvel comic book. I don't really know for sure because I remember the comic books actually being good. I will say, I'm not sure how I feel about his design. It's way too similar to Black Panther. I don't care if it's supposed to be a golden jaguar suit, it's a cat of some kind, but I guess it works in the movie. Andy Serkis plays Ulysses Claw. We did see him in the Age of Ultron movie, and I love his design from that movie. I immediately recognized who that character is supposed to be from the split second he was in the Avengers trailer. I don't like the design of his fake hand in this movie though. Why does he have a fake hand? He's supposed to have this cannon looking thing on his arm. Speaking of Lord of the Rings, Martin Freeman is here as the token white guy, Everett K. Ross. He did appear in the Civil War movie. I think he's supposed to be a CIA agent of some sort. He didn't really have much of a purpose than to be the token white guy. He did have a moment where he said Wakanda is just a third world country, so he shows how the world sees Wakanda. But come on, how can you see T'Challa wear something like this and still think nothing strange about Wakanda? Damn, all the actresses' names in this movie are hard to pronounce, but I'm gonna try anyway. Lupita Nyong'o plays the love interest in this movie. Her character was not necessary. I don't even recall if she did much in this film. Honestly, now that Disney owns Fox, I think we should forget about her and replace her with Storm. Letitia Wright plays the little sister Shuri, and she's great. Her character is the intelligent one that designs all these amazing tech, but because she is the little sister, she also acts very young. She's really fun to watch. Most of the comedy comes from her. There are also lots of other characters I can talk about, like Denai Goria as Okoye or Winston Duke as Manape, but just know that everyone did great playing their part. Finally, the CGI in this movie wasn't the greatest. But I do say if you can't make something look realistic, make it look pretty. This movie is amazing to look at. Although the Wakandan culture doesn't exist, it looks so beautiful that I want it to exist. I mean, I'm sure the designs are based on real African culture, but stuff like the designs of the cliffside are amazing. And if you're tired of looking at the African environment, they go to South Korea for a little bit for variety. Side note, is Black Panther even allowed in South Korea? I'm pretty sure the Accords make it illegal for Black Panther to just enter South Korea for his own personal mission. Maybe they mentioned it, but the Accords doesn't really seem to have any effect. Back on the topic of CGI, I also love the purple shockwaves because I usually see Vibranium being portrayed as purple, so seeing it in that color was cool. Although there are other scenes where Vibranium's blue, which I found kind of strange. Although this movie has a lot of meh CGI, I think it was necessary. Some of the camera angles they do for fights alongside with the fight moves they do would have been too hard to do practically. Although it does have lots of CGI, I think it was utilized well. It won't age well though. Final thoughts, this is a really good movie. It's obvious they weren't relying on the fact that the character is black to sell tickets for the movie. They really tried making a great movie. Final score, 9 out of 10. I was tempted giving this a 10 out of 10, but the ending could have been more climactic. The purpose of some characters was questionable, but the movie is still very good. The character motivations were great, the visuals were spectacular, the lack of comedy is refreshing, and it still manages to be as lighthearted as other Marvel movies. Honestly, I don't see much reasons not to see this movie. It works very well as a standalone. There are after credit scenes like usual, but you really don't need to see them. Usually you see something big that sets up a sequel. Although they do set up sequels, they aren't anything you don't already know. It is an Iron Man 3 pointless, but still pretty pointless.